Welcome back, my subscribers. In this video, we're talking about a creative bokeh lens from Lomography.
This is the Macro Marvin channel, where he'll share his passion for photography, videography, watches, cats, cars, and much more. Enjoy and thank you for watching.
This is a very interesting lens. Up front, I'm going to tell you, Lomography was nice enough to send me this lens. They did not tell me what to do or pay me any money to do this review, but I wanted to just share that up front. This is my honest review after shooting with this lens for about 2 weeks. And it's really intriguing because there's a lot of different things going on with this thing. So I want to go through it and you can decide if this is a lens for you or not, if it adds that creative aspect that you're missing in your work, if you want something interesting. Lomography is really focused on classic style lenses, more on the artistic approach. Lomography is focused on the art aspect of photography. And that's a very different thing when you're looking at how they design their lenses, where they take inspiration from, and what features they put into these things. So I think it's been a different experience for myself, since I'm used to using like G Master lenses, or I've used a few Leica lenses, or even just like your standard 85 1.8 or your prime lenses, zoom lenses. You don't usually think about what can make a lens more creative, because these are more like tools. Yes, they have great bokeh and stuff like that, but for the most part, a lot of our new modern lenses are created to be perfect, or to correct a lot of the things that we deem as not great in the picture, like chromatic aberrations, focus, breathing, all those kinds of things. When you don't correct for some of these things, you end up with interesting effects. And that is what we had a lot when we had vintage lenses, which you can still buy. But this is an interesting company that I really have liked learning about, because their style is to bring back old school style lenses that have those quirks, that character, that will make an image pop or look different. And it's not always about sharpness, not about perfection. Reviewing this lens really changed my mind on how I approached it. Usually I go into a lens and it's very straightforward. With this one, I think there was a bit of a learning curve, just because you have to learn to appreciate or kind of work your way into what style. I'll go through some basic specs. As I'm talking, you'll see some image samples, and you can let me know down in the comments if you like the look or not. And first off, this is a 64mm f2. Right off the bat, 64mm is not a common focal length. So if you are a 50mm shooter, this is going to be slightly more cropped into that. And honestly, when I'm thinking about this focal length, it was a bit interesting, because it is focused more on like a portrait style focal length, but at the same time, it didn't quite feel like an 85, and it didn't quite capture as much in the field, in the perspective, as a 50 or a 35. So 64 was actually one of my first challenges in reviewing this lens, and just getting accustomed to imagining what an image could look like when I'm planning for a shot, or just seeing through this focal length. Very different approach. So like I said, it's not quite telephoto, but it's also not a normal focal length. So I would say from that aspect, it was a bit of a challenge, and you do have to work with it and use it to learn to see through a 64mm focal length on full frame. Now, f2, nothing to complain there. f2, I think, is plenty enough for a lens like this, being creative. Not all lenses have to be super fast, but I think f2 is plenty fast. Now, what's cool about this lens is it is a metal construction. It has a screw-in hood, which is pretty flush to the body of the lens. That was redundant. This is a lens that you're going to be very selective about using, because you may want what you would consider a normal photo. This is more of an artistic perspective. So into the mechanical pieces of this, we have the aperture ring, we have the focusing ring, and we have what they call the bokeh control. Now this is where this lens gets interesting. We have 3 different levels. We have soft, classic, and bubble. Depending on what you want to get out of this lens, this is where it does take time to learn this lens. You can't just put it on and start shooting. You need to think about what type of look do you want. And this is something interesting. Usually if you want a soft or like a halo blooming effect, you put a filter on. You use like a black mist filter or one of those. In this case, you can just put the lever down to soft. If you want something more straightforward and regular, you go to cloud. If you want a bubble bokeh effect, you put it to bubble, which is technically an overcorrected feature that is not the standard feature, which is why it's categorized as an artistic lens. Now, in my sample images, I took the same style of shot using these 3 different settings in different situations. I wanted to see what setting kind of shines in a different situation. So I found myself many times when I wanted a standard photo with a normal look, I would just go for classic. When I wanted something that had imperfections or more character, not as sharp, I would put it on soft, which makes sense, which is why they called it soft. Now, I will say putting it into soft will give you this, based off of my experience with putting it in soft, I found that it worked better when you were in a close to medium distance to your subject, which kind of makes sense because this is, if you look at the samples from their website or the booklet that comes in the packaging, they are portrait focused. So keeping in mind 64, approaching it from a portrait perspective, the softness does add an interesting look to your subjects. So I did find close to medium distance being good for soft. Classic, medium to infinity, I think was good. And bubble, I think was more in the middle. Not close and not far. So you'll see in the samples, the lens will behave differently depending on what you put it on. Now, what causes this effect? And after studying this thing a few times, based off of how I was using it, when you have it in soft, you're basically moving the elements further out. As you go into classic, they start pulling back in, and bubble being the closest to you. So if you look through the viewfinder, you start to notice how the image pushes away or pushes towards you. The further away, the more bloom effect you're getting, which is a very interesting thing of how this lens was designed. So kudos to Lomography for having this very unique system where you don't necessarily, like I wouldn't put a filter on this because I could just put it in soft. Now, let's talk a little bit about the ergonomics and use of this lens. I have it paired here with the A7C2, and I would say it pairs pretty balanced. I like how lightweight this lens is, and it's actually a pretty petite fit, which is not too long and not too small. Pretty medium-sized lens, but it feels right at home on a compact camera like this. But not to say you can't put it on your A7R5 or whatever. They have this lens in several mounts. In this case, I'm trying it on the Sony because that just made more sense with what I have right now to use this one. So I think it's a pretty good fit if you want to go on the go, taking some casual shots or taking some portrait shots, and having the ability to swap between those modes is very interesting, as you'll see in the samples. Now, when it comes to usability, this is something I do want to focus on. There are, like I said, aperture and the focusing. They are not clicky. So they're just smooth, which you would consider to be like a more video focused feature. It is a bit noisy if you can hear it. That's the aperture. This is the focusing ring. This may be more of a con of the design. The resistance feels a bit weird. And I think it may be because this is a plastic wheel on a metal body. And that's my theory. So it's not quite smooth. So you do feel some resistance, but it feels almost like a sort of grinding smoothness. It feels almost kind of like a grinding movement, to be honest. Like when you rub plastic against plastic. So I'm not a fan of how that felt. Luckily, the aperture range, the amount of twist you have to do to get from f2 to f16 is about a fourth. Let me see. It's about a quarter of a turn, which isn't bad. You can go really quick from f2 to f16. But I will say, because of the position of the focusing ring, that's something I did struggle with. It is a bit too close to the mount, and because it is a very slim ring, many times I found myself a little lost because my hands naturally go to the focusing, to the aperture ring, which is where I was hoping, or where my hands usually go to for focusing. This lens has it further to the back. So if you see my hands, this is my natural position. This is the aperture. But to focus, I have to go one step back. So it was kind of an awkward feel to have to put my hand further back and tighter to focus it. And then my last complaint here is that because my hand is so close to the body of the camera, my hand mobility is limited. So the throw on the focusing ring is pretty long. So let's see. That's almost a full turn. You see that? Look, the camera's straight. I guess it's like a 180, but it feels like it's almost a full turn. So you can imagine if your hands are this close and I'm having to force my hands to be closer to the camera, I can't really spin this fast enough or smooth enough. This focusing ring is actually a lot more dampened than the aperture. So there were times where I had to kind of go like this and just try to get it quicker to the distance I was at. And because the guide is a little bit tricky here, there is a line there to match if you're at infinity or not, or close. But I feel like that was just a bit of a challenge in terms of the mechanics and usability of this lens. But let's move forward. Those are just quirks that I found in using it. It did kind of slow me down here and there. I'm actually very used to using manually focusing lenses, but unfortunately that piece did slow me down a bit. Okay, let's talk about the image quality. Now, like I said, we've got soft, classic, and bubble. There were times where it was difficult to focus this lens under the soft setting, and it is mainly because soft is soft. It has a very strong blooming effect, even with the lens hood when you're using it in strong sunlight or a very strong, like a light source that's close to you. It does make you guess if you're in focus. I know I was using focus peaking and zooming in at the same time, and I can do it pretty fast on this camera. Thankfully, Sony has made it really easy where I can press the zoom and I can adjust. So right there, I'll show you an example. So I'm putting it in infinity and I'm going to aim at the camera. So right there, that took me about 2 to 3 seconds, I think. But even there, where I'm thinking it's sharp, it's not that quite sharp. So if you're using this, this is not going to be a product photography lens or a sport lens. Like, you have to know what this is for, which is why I said you need to be deliberate when you pick this lens. If you're picking it for portraits, I think this is just going to be what this lens is good at, or better at, depending on your preference. If you're looking for a dreamy look that is very bloom, where your highlights are spread out a bit more, soften the skin, that sort of thing, this is going to give you kind of a more intense look than a filter would. So you have to be deliberate about the distance your subject's at and the type of lighting you have. So those are two things that you have to be very aware of when you're using soft. Not to say I didn't get shots that I didn't like a lot, using soft, but I did find it to be challenging, especially going beyond the middle to infinity range, where you're definitely losing a lot of sharpness, and you kind of get lost of what you actually focused on, and you might think it's you or it's the lens. You get confused which one's which, but it's just that blooming effect that just removes a lot of the sharpness, and you have to really lean into wanting a dreamy, blown out or glowy image. It's a very strong effect, I would say. You can technically control it. You don't have to be in the extreme of soft. You can do something that's half soft, between soft and classic, and that would kind of correct some of that. Oh, there you go again. I was using the aperture ring instead of the focusing. That's what I was trying to explain earlier. So I could see, so right there in the in-between effect, I think I would be a lot more happier taking a portrait shot, using it in an in-between section, which is neat that you can pick gradually how far you want that effect to go. So similar, when you're in classic, and there is actually like a clicking feeling when you're in classic, so you know you're in the middle. In classic, like I said, it's a more standard shot. There's nothing that's going to stand out about the image aside from you getting a little bit more pastel-y colors because of the way this lens is made. I'm not a technical person, so I don't understand 100% how the elements work to achieve this effect. I just know that this is based off of an older style lens. The booklet it comes with is pretty handy. It gives you an idea of what images you can get out of this before you try shooting them, to kind of shape the image in your mind, depending on the setting you use. When using it in bubble, it's basically what it's telling you, that any bokeh that you have in the image has that hollow look, that strong outline on the circle, making it look like a bubble. So depending on what you're going for, this is basically a lens, like it said, is an artistic lens. So if you are going for that type of character, you have to really lean into it because it looks completely different, and we're not used to seeing that in a lot of modern lenses. I think I really enjoyed the bubble look when I was doing some out of focus shots of some foliage. I think the bubble stands out, benefits from having foliage in the background of your subject, because foliage is just known to create a lot of bokeh. And so you'll see the effect stronger when it's in bubble. I did some close-up shots of some flowers under the soft setting. I did like them, but like I said, you have to want that blooming effect. If not, this is going to be a lens that's going to shock you of how the character is so strong. And obviously, I think someone who would be looking for this lens wouldn't be looking for a perfect lens. This is something that's going to give you a different style of shot. So my pictures, I think, were for the most part more interesting, I think. I can't say it was a clear embrace of the lens. It did take me a bit of time to understand how to use it and when to use it. I think that's a very important thing to understand from this brand. This is the first time I use a lens from this company. So I'm going to assume that when you have this many type of controls on a lens, you have to be very selective in how you use it. The distance of your subject, the aperture, how strong of the effect do you want? What's your lighting? How far are you from your subject? That sort of thing. So you do have to think about your shot a lot more. Now, let's talk about another interesting fact about this lens, and that is that there's a drop-in filter mount in the back where you can modify how the lens renders out of focus area, the bokeh. When I was looking at how to use this, it came in the box, came with the lens, you get the booklet that I mentioned, and you get a little case where you have several little metal plates that go into the back of the lens. So inside the box, you get a little booklet, QR code, you scan that, it takes you to the manual. So it takes you to a general page, you search for the lens you have. I had the 64. This basically shows you that to use these little plates, you need to remove the lens, and at the back of it, you're going to see some grooves. You have to spin those grooves. You have to unscrew them. So you basically, I used my nail because there's several bumps. You hold on to it and you start spinning it. That removes this piece from the back. This goes downwards. So then, I already had one in place, but just to show you, that's what this little plate goes in. There are a couple of these little plates. There's stars, there's hearts, there's snowflakes. You drop it in, you center it, and then you place this back on there to screw it in place. And basically, anytime you take a photo moving forward, the bokeh or any lights that are out of focus will take the form of that shape. So it's a very neat thing. It's a theme of being artistic, of being different, adding character. Now, is this something that I would use professionally? I would say it depends on the situation. I think for the most part, it kind of gave me like a holiday vibe to use a certain type of aperture blade or aperture plate, my bad. I would have to you have to be very deliberate about which one you pick. And it's not going to work for every single image. So always keep that in mind with this brand, with this lens and the accessory. Because we're talking about being artistic and putting a little bit more thought into what your final image should look like when you consider the character that you're going for. Is it going to be soft? Is it going to be classic? Do you want bubble bokeh? Okay. Is your bubble or soft bokeh going to have a shape? So you have to think about these things, and you're not going to take, I would say I would not take like 100 shots with a certain aperture shape, because it's more of a deliberate thing to do to get a couple shots with this. Not to say you can't, but I would say unless you're doing something that's like a related work where you want that consistency, then I would say go for it. But other than that, I would not pull out like the snowflake for any situation other than like a holiday season where I can get like a Christmas tree lights out of focus in the shape of a snowflake, which would be neat for doing family portraits or just pictures for fun to make that artistic effect. There's geometric ones on there. So depending on what you're really going for, I think the positive about this lens and this brand is that they've really made it so that you can craft what experience you want to have with it. If you're not into, for the most, let's say you're a person who's a little bit more conservative with their photos, I think I would be considered one of those people. You just keep it in classic. But every so often, you might see an opportunity where you're like, wow, it would look interesting if this subject was more glowy, or if I had this bubble bokeh, or just experiment and see through the viewfinder, because we're using mirrorless cameras, you can preview how the bokeh looks. So you can play with this lever to kind of figure out what look will fit the image that you're going after. And the step beyond that would be to add these aperture plates. So in that sense, I think this lens is very creative. It feels good, feels well built. My biggest complaint is going to continue to be how close this focusing ring is to the mount. And my hand just naturally going to where the aperture is. Instead, I would say the focusing ring should have been where the aperture ring is. And the aperture ring typically is at even a further front spot, but I think it would have been better if they were flipped. And the levers, I think this might just be part of the lens design. You can't really choose where the levers would go. Overall, a fun lens. I wouldn't say it would be something I grab or gravitate to all the time, but there are situations where when I used it, that I was like, this is definitely a classic picture that I want. And I want it to be sharp. And I will say, I didn't talk about that. In classic, you will get decent sharpness. It's not going to be overly sharp. It's not going to be blurry or anything. You'll get enough sharpness. And I did take a lot of good shots that I enjoyed. I think my favorite shots that I was like, this is the scene I'm imagining, were taken in the Classic. But when I was looking around at like foliage, I was like, I really would want to see how this looks in either soft or bubble. So you really have to make up your mind and experiment with this lens, which is, I think, in the spirit of what the company is trying to accomplish. So I hope you enjoyed this video and enjoyed the samples. Thanks again to Lomography for sending the sample. I'm going to ship it back. But it was a great experience to see where I could go with it, because this is so different, so out of the box. I hope you enjoyed this video.